tabling. Are there any notice of questions? Are there any notice of motions to introduce bills? Are there any notice of motions for disallowance? Are there any notices of motions? Are there any motions without notice? We move to non-government business. Non-government business number 1, World Suicide Prevention Day and Are You OK Day. The Honourable Lynn MacLaren.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the motion standing in my name that the Council recognises World Suicide Prevention Day and Are You OK Day, and that members undertake to publicise suicide prevention programs among their constituents, acknowledge the risk factors facing people in their regions, actively support non-government and government programs to prevent suicide, and express our condolences to those who have been affected by the suicide of a loved one, co-worker, or friend.
Now the question is the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Lynn MacLaren.
Mr. President, the Greens have 3 opportunities in a sitting period in which to put motions on the agenda where people are invited to comment. And it is, obviously we have many competing priorities for that time. Today I've chosen to raise this motion and in the tenor of the motion, which is intended to encourage people to contribute, because someone that I know committed suicide not too long ago. And in my position in this House, I thought it was important for me to honor that person by raising awareness in this way. Now, the person who took their life wasn't a close friend of mine, but it was truly what you could call a comrade, someone who campaigned tirelessly for social justice. And when I encountered this person, was truly passionate and articulate about her sense of helping others. So it was in that spirit that I thought, we need to debate this, we need to talk about this, because Amber would have wanted this. Amber would have wanted us to shout from the rooftops that it is not okay to continue to allow anyone to feel that their only option is to take their life. So I'm hoping that my work colleagues here, and we spend many days together and many hours, took the time to review what the situation is in our electorates. And if you did, and you had some time to reflect, you would have easily found the materials for Are You OK Day, which encourage you to strike up a conversation, and that is why we're doing this. If you located the Suicide and Suicide Prevention in Australia report, Breaking the Silence, you would have discovered a lot of the alarming statistics about this. I mean, I was surprised to find out that it was such a leading cause of death. I was surprised to find out that one of the problems with figuring out what the causes of or leading the risk factors to suicide is that we don't accurately record when a suicide occurs. There are lots of social stigmas, there's hang-ups that people have about whether to acknowledge suicide, and so generally we still have an underreporting of the incidence of suicide. One of the alarming things, if you looked in the news reports last year, was that Western Australia apparently recorded a particularly high rate of suicide. In fact, the highest incidence in Australia. And as a state, that did ring alarm bells at the time, and I know it was debated in this House. Suicide is actually the leading cause of death globally and in Australia. And to look at the numbers, and what I intend to do with my contribution to this debate is just broadly cover the issues in the hope that members who have a particular passion for something can focus on it, because you cannot do this justice in 20 minutes. And I am hoping that people will be able to comment on particular areas that they're aware of or that bring them or cause concern for them. There are 2,200 suicide deaths per annum, and 80% of these are male, and that was one of the reasons why we saw an increase, or was given as one of the reasons why suicide might have increased, because our male population as a percentage of population increased. It's the leading cause of death for adult males that are aged under the age of 44, and it's the leading cause of death for women under the age of 34, and it's a notable cause of death in males over 75. I was surprised to learn that deaths due to suicide exceed fatalities from motor vehicle accidents and homicides combined. So there was quite a few studies about how many suicides we have, and I guess the one thing I took from that was that, you know, we really do need to invest a bit more in research and in record keeping. And I think in 2009, the ABS did do a significant change in their recording so that we can, from this point on, try to track that. But it's true to say that suicide and suicidal behavior both bear substantial human, social, and economic costs. And in Australia, there are no detailed studies on the cost of suicide and self-harm to the Australian community. Now, the parties to this report, which was a very significant contribution to the body of work on suicide prevention in Australia, they held the strong belief that suicide is preventable. I share that. And actually, Are You OK Day brings home how easy it can be to just have a meaningful conversation with someone and change their life in that instance. It's supported actually by really strong evidence that access to crisis support, intervention, and direct programs can contribute significantly to preventing suicide. And in fact, a quarter of the population are poorly informed. And that's why we need to be talking about it. There's room for improvement in the use of a community-wide education around suicide and suicide awareness campaigns. We have to break that stigma of talking about it. The research shows that we need to have a diverse approach, and there's no single readily identifiable high-risk population that constitutes a sizable proportion of overall suicides, but yet it's small enough to easily target and have an effect. So again, that research is incredibly important. But I have mentioned on a few occasions in this House the high-risk group of lesbian, gay, transsexual, and bi individuals, and in particular intersex individuals. They are acknowledged as one of the higher risk populations. In addition to mental illness and substance abuse, a range of social factors contribute to the risk of suicide. Several population groups within Australia have been identified as having a high risk of suicidal ideation. That means you're thinking about it. They've either completed or they've attempted suicide. And those high-risk groups include men, Indigenous Australians, people who have previously attempted suicide, gay, lesbian, and transgender persons, rural and remote residents, youth, people bereaved by suicide, ethnic, culturally, and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and those who've recently left health or institutional care. That certainly has been on our minds in the last 2 years with the publication, the highly publicized incidents following of suicide for patients who have left our mental health institutions. And we're certainly more aware that you're at a high risk of suicide if you're being discharged from a mental health institution. So if you have sought help and you've been in hospital for a mental health condition or disorder, or even if you're having an incident, you are at high risk in that first period of discharge. And we know that because this government has been investigating incidents where people have taken their lives after being discharged. Available evidence shows that clinical depression, substance use disorders, and other mental health problems continue to be common and recurrent risk factors, particularly in male suicide. So that might be one of the reasons why we have a high rate of that. I wanted just to touch on the sexuality, sex, gender diversity rates of suicide, because research findings demonstrate that suicide attempt and self-harm among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities are significantly higher than among non-LGBT populations, revealing that LGBT individuals attempt suicide at rates between 3.5 and 14 times those of their heterosexual peers. That's a huge range, isn't it? 3.5 and 14 times. But that's because if you're on that end of the spectrum where you're intersex, I think you're 14 times higher at risk of committing suicide than heterosexual and cisgender people. Self-harm statistics show that 28% of lesbians versus 8.3% of heterosexual females and 20.8% of gay men versus 5.4% of heterosexual males report deliberate self-harm. So it's really important that we do have programs that specifically target these high-risk groups and address mental illness and their struggles. It's one of the recommendations of this report and the National Action Plan for Suicide Prevention in Australia is that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities be recognized as a higher risk group in suicide prevention strategies, policies, and programs, and that funding for targeted approaches to prevent suicide in LGBT communities be made available. So that's just a few of the facts around suicide. And the minister today gave us an overview of what the state of Western Australia is doing in its suicide prevention strategies in her acknowledgement of Are You OK Day. I would encourage members to look in your electorates at what is being delivered for your constituents to assist in suicide prevention. If you're in a rural or a regional area where the rates of suicide, I think they peaked in 2007, but we know that people who are under financial stress and farmers who are struggling to make a living in changing conditions of the climate are certainly in that in that risk group. I would really encourage you to look specifically into your electorates and find out, do they have e-health? Do they have online health services? Do they have easy access to mental health support and even just community support where they can be supported through their times of stress? That is one of the recommendations from the Senate inquiry that came around Australia and looked at the rural and regional state of mental health. There's a report on the web called Voices and Experiences, Improving Mental Health Services in Country Australia. And for our regional members, I heartily encourage you to have a look at this report. This particular one was the senator from the Greens who was on that committee, and she makes a summary of the recommendations around that and how we can address the needs of people in rural areas and regional areas. So I commend that report to you and I invite you to become familiar with it. Also, the Greens WA released in the state election under the admirable leadership of the Honourable Alison Zaman MLC, who's now retired, the Greens WA Forensic Mental Health Action Plan. And that too is a much more specific to Western Australia list of recommendations for programs that we can put our efforts into establishing. Now, the reason why I wanted to focus a little bit on transgender suicide is because Amber was a transgender individual. She struggled to find shelter. She was homeless, unable to adjust to living at home with her family in her time of transition. And she struggled with homelessness for much of her young life. I think she was only 19. Amber sought help from shelters and had difficulty because she is transgender. She also tried to find private rental accommodation and answered ads for, women to share a house, and then when she turned up, was turned away because she didn't fit the criteria of the people who were offering accommodation. I know that she worked to help other people and empower them about how to use the system to get help, to get housing, to just find a way to survive when you're on the margins. And I hope that we can change the system so that people who find themselves just a little bit outside the normative range of services can actually find that help. These are the people most at risk, and we have an obligation to assist them. I want to briefly talk about Amber, and this was published on the Socialist Alliance website. The revolutionary socialist movement lost a great fighter on Saturday, the 24th of August. Amber Maxwell lived a difficult life. As a transgender woman, she found it impossible to find permanent work or accommodation. But through all her hardship, she put everything she had into the fight for socialism. Amber seemed to have boundless energy and enthusiasm for politics. Every week, she would catch the bus from the homeless youth hostel where she lived to the University of Western Australia to help us build the organization, sell Red Flag, fight cuts to higher education, and campaign for refugee rights. I knew her as a campaigner for equal love, and she was always a very passionate speaker on the stage. Amber was always the one leading impromptu paper sales, organizing extra chalking and postering for demonstrations, selling far more copies of Red Flag than anyone else on the stalls. Even when she, in her most depressed state, she always told me that socialist activism and fighting for a better world was the one thing that made life worth living. Rarely have I met a comrade so determined and dedicated. Amber took her own life at the age of 20, unable to deal with her oppression any longer. Her death should not be viewed as a random tragedy, but as a product of transphobia, and I can tell you she never burst into tears. She had this core of strength and anger, and when she spoke, there was no trauma. It was just strength. So I'll try and channel that for a minute. Could I have glass cold water? Thanks. I'm nearly there. We'll get there. As a product, her death should not be viewed as a random tragedy, but as a product of transphobia. Thank you. And a lack of essential services for young people. Suicide is an epidemic among LGBTI youth. Studies in Australia show the attempted suicide rate among LGBTI people is between 3.5 and 14 times higher, and we've heard that. A survey in the USA found that 32% of transgender people interviewed had attempted suicide. Now, I went to Amber's memorial, which was following the Equal Love rally this year, two weeks ago, and she had many friends and comrades, people who really appreciated her. And they really did her a good service. And at the rally, We had, instead of a minute of silence, a minute of rage. And in that moment of rage, we connected on a level that won't go away. We will continue to work for a better world, no matter what your gender is, and no matter how old you are. You have a right to services. You have a right to live your life peacefully and have a job and contribute to society. Amber showed us that she worked hard to do that. And I hope that in her passing, we can institute change so that other young people don't have to suffer the way she did.
Question is the motion be agreed to. The Minister for Mental Health.
Thanks, Mr. President. And
Question is the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Lynn MacLaren.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to reply to the contributions that have been made during this debate and thank all members who applied themselves to address this very important issue. I know that we all lead very busy lives, and this is an optional debate for people to participate in. And it's sometimes difficult to get your head around things that arrived yesterday on our desk as something that is important. But I do welcome the fact that a few members were able to apply themselves and address the motion. And indeed, there was unanimous support for the motion, which I gratefully appreciate. I want to thank in particular the Minister who reminded us about the efforts that we can make to reduce the risk of suicide in the lives of our friends and family, and also who the Minister reminded us of the efforts that the state government is making to support suicide prevention programs across a range of issues and services. She reminded me that you can't really know when someone is going to hit that point where they do take their lives, and even if you're on suicide risk, you can't completely be confident that you're going to stop that individual from taking their life. There's a particularly poignant quote in the Breaking the Silence report from a mother who talks about how they had a wonderful family dinner. Her son was laughing and joking and had a great time, and they thought he was safe, and an hour later he was gone. And really, you cannot really know when someone's going to reach that point. And you are not in control of it. Unfortunately, they are. And it's this responsibility, I guess, that we have for our own existence that I feel really, really strongly about. And I really appreciated the Honourable Liz Bagette's contribution, because she mentioned that having a faith, having a belief in something other than oneself, having those connections with friends and family are all factors which are protective factors for suicide. So we need to talk about those and actually acknowledge the value of those factors in our lives. In my own life, I feel it's very important that that responsibility for my life is carried with me throughout to my death. And unlike the Honourable Nick Garand, who has made a point about voluntary euthanasia, I do feel that that is a responsibility that I should have. And while I acknowledge his contribution and the fact that he took time to comment and support the motion, I don't think it goes into the area that I wanted us to focus on today. And I would continue to disagree with him on that point about voluntary euthanasia, which is a debate for another day. I wanted to remind members that, and in particular, I wanted to, in concluding my thank yous, thank the Honourable Sally Talbot, who reminded us of the connection between things like marriage equality, which addresses a stigma that's attached to one's sexual preference, and one's need for one's relationship to be recognized as equal to other relationships, and the link that that has with self-esteem and a sense of belonging in community, which are two factors, also protective factors for suicide. So I really welcome that, and I look forward to more conversations about the status of lesbian and gay relationships, and how we can pass that marriage equality legislation as soon as possible. We focused a lot on mental illness as being a key risk factor for suicide. I mentioned being male as a high factor, and some of the stresses of being male were mentioned by the Honourable Liz Bégette. We didn't touch much on the specific, we did touch on substance abuse, and particular alcohol addiction or alcohol misuse, and that being often connected with suicide. There are also other factors like anorexia and depression, psychotic disorders, and if you've got a history of suicide attempts. Other things which are risk factors for suicide are family breakdown and family conflict. And I mentioned that in relation to Amber, who suffered a bit through that. In spite of, I know, the loving attempts of her family to find a place in their lives for her. You know, it's not that, I know in this particular case that there was, there was love in that family, and there was acceptance, and it was just a very difficult circumstance that they found themselves in. And I don't mean to in any way ascribe any kind of responsibility in this tragic death. I just want to point out that deaths like this can be prevented. We can reduce the transgender stigma and the high rates of transgender suicide. And I would like to do that in my time in this Parliament, if that's at all possible. But also things like socioeconomic disadvantage, unemployment, being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. We didn't go into a lot of detail, but that again could be an entire debate on the rates of suicide amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. School disengagement, incarceration, and social and geographic isolation. And also environmental factors like, and this is that thing, exposure to suicide methods, and if there's a suicide in your peer group, so the risk factor goes up, and that's why it's really important that we talk about it. It's really important that as people are confronted with the reality that people can commit suicide, they should also be offered those tools to cope, those tools to protect themselves from falling into the risk of suiciding. So, and that includes being connected with a family, being connected with your friends, meaningful connections, not just superficial ones where you can really talk to people. Connected with your community, or even having a sporting club or a recreation group. Having at least one significant person that you can relate to. Having personal coping skills and resilience. Resilience is another thing we could talk about all day. And building resilience in individuals and communities. That sense of meaning in one's life. Economic security, particularly in older people. And I talked in my budget speech about older people are at more risk of homelessness now. Homelessness is something which is a risk factor in suicide. But also good physical as well as mental health. So parliamentarians, I don't do enough exercise, I confess. And I'm sure many of us fall into that as well. So doing that regular exercise and keeping your sense of well-being high is really important. So let's remember to do that. And also restricted access to the means of suicide, such as firearms, prescription medication, and certain geographic locations, which we touched on the high risk in rural and regional areas. I want to finish my comments on this motion in expressing my deep appreciation for members who have listened respectfully and offered me support for the motion, by expressing my condolences to Amber Maxwell's friends and family and comrades. I know that their loss is a deep one, and in the coming months when you go through those cycles of grief, that there will be times when coping is very difficult. And I trust that they reach out and find a friend to help them through that period of distress that you feel when you've lost someone that you care about. So on that, members, I commend the motion to the House.
The question is the motion be agreed to? Yeah. The motion actually lapses due to our standing orders, but I think the intent of the House is quite clear that it's been supported unanimously. Moving on to non-government business number 2, local government, forced amalgamations. Does the Honourable Lynn MacLaren wish to start this one?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the motion standing in my name. Would you care to read it?
Sure.
Thank you.
The Honourable Lynn MacLaren has moved that the Council calls upon the Barnett Government to A, acknowledge the outpouring of community concern regarding the Government's process for forced local government amalgamations, B, not proceed with removing the Daydor Amendment from the Local Government Act 1995, C, recognise the principle that local communities should be the drivers of policies in relation to council amalgamation, and D, consider that changes to council boundaries should consider shared communities of interest. The question is that motion be agreed to. The Honourable Lynn MacLaren.